Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Joey Hessel, Vice President of Jewish Life at the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life at 92Y. And as part of our engagement and to reach out to unaffiliated Jews, particularly those of color, we are delighted to present, along with JFNA and the Forward as partners, this wonderful series of talks entitled Black Jewish History, Black Jewish Futures. And back for a second round with us tonight is our teacher from last week, Robin Washington, who is the editor-at-large at the Forward. He was raised in Chicago by Black and Jewish civil rights activists, and at the age of 3 remembers doing family outings, which were actually sit-ins and protests. So it's all relative to what we know. So that was his family time. Little did he realize he was trying to impact the world at only 3 years of age. He's also a host for Wisconsin Public Radio and was previously an editorial board member for the Boston Globe and editor-in-chief of the Duluth News Tribune. He also has a critically acclaimed PBS documentary entitled "You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow." So without any further ado, Robin, thank you again for being with us. We look forward to learning from you, and I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you. I will gladly accept, and thank you so much, Rabbi Joey. Also, thank you to the 92nd Street Y, to J. I always get the N and the F in the wrong order, so to the Federation, so wherever you are and all over the country, and of course to the Forward, my affiliation, and all of you for being here, because some of you are not from any of those, so it's great to see a diversity of people. That's what it's all about. So I want to start, though, with a quiz question. And if you, there's a couple of people out here who I know already know the answer, so don't cheat. A couple of you are excused from answering this, but seriously, if you don't know, if you're not quite sure what we're talking about here today, I just want to throw out to anyone who may have been affiliated with the 92nd Street Y a few decades ago, about the time that I was growing up in Chicago, the civil rights activists and everything. If anyone recalls and wants to take a guess about a group of young people that met there every Sunday in the 60s, late 60s, or mid-late 60s, so 1964 to, I would say, the end of the decade. Want to take a guess what they were there doing? So take a guess, because guesses are good. Somebody say something so I can, or I'll call on you. How about Rabbi Joe? Oh, well, no, we do have, okay.
Maybe planning protests?
Planning protests, okay, that's a good idea. So let's keep that in mind. It made sense at that time too, right? In the 60s. So we're here talking about a program called Hatzaad Harishon. By the way, my Hebrew speakers, of which I am not very much among that group, have been saying it's interesting as I talk to them about this. They say Hatzaad Harishon, and so it's sort of like the Ha part of Rishon is actually the Ha in of Hatzadah. Rabbi, you can correct me or whatever, or we can let one of those Hebrew speakers is on this thing. I know, so when she joins in, good luck. So good luck to me. But it means the first step in Hebrew, and it was a program as designed to be outreach toward Black Jews, or putting Black Jews and white Jews together in the 1960s. As we look back and we know about the Black Jewish Alliance and the Civil Rights Movement, that sounds like a perfectly natural thing to do. It wasn't. And that's why we decided to talk about it. We have 2 stories that are in the Forward today. And of course, they will remain there online at infinitum. They are, and the titles are, you can look them up here. Could Israelites be brought into mainstream Judaism? 50 years ago, one effort did just that. The other story is Hatzaad Harishon, broke barriers until race identity question proved to be too much. So what was this program? One of our people, by the way, our audience members, is Dennis Fernheimer. She wrote an entire book about this. There's not much more I can tell her. Here is her book. You can see I have been studying it, cramming, I think, right? And the title is Stepping into Zion, Hatzaad Harishon, Black Jews and the Remaking of Jewish Identity. And Janice is a professor, quite esteemed, at the University of Kentucky, in rhetoric. And so she's really examining this Jewish identity, even the word Jew. And right now there's a whole bunch of discussion. What are Jews, right? Are we a race? Are we a religion? Are we a people? Are we a nationality? Are we all of those or none of those? And the answer is yeah. Any way you want to describe it. So notice that we titled one of the articles, Could Israelites be brought into mainstream Judaism? 50 years ago, one effort did just that. So first I want to get into who are Israelites, okay? And are they the same as what you hear in the rest of the media? I'm proud to say not in the forward so much anymore. Black Hebrew Israelites, no in the stories about Black Hebrew Israelites usually having some problem. At the Capitol with the kids from Covington High School, Catholic High School, and that disturbance, people who've engaged in some violent acts are said to be connected to Black Hebrew Israelites. I think that's interesting because connected to doesn't necessarily mean you belong to something, right? In fact, I'm going to digress on that just a bit to tell you how much I care about language. The attack, I believe, in New Jersey against Jews by an African-American man. All our friends in the media, of my colleagues, or many of them, reported that he had literature in his house connecting him or suggesting Black Hebrew Israelites. And it was saying that this was a hate group as identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And, there you go, draw your own conclusion. Well, time out. You can go in my house and find all kinds of literature, I guarantee you, from all kinds of religions. And is that to say if a Catholic person or if a person, did some horrible attack on some other religion institution or whatever, and they took catechism classes that they are Catholics? Necessarily, right? We've heard of lapsed Catholics. So in all seriousness, Black Hebrew Israelite is really a conflation of many different things. There are Jewish groups who I'm going to get into their history, or groups of Judaic people, let's put it that way, who use the word Israelite. There is an Israelite board of rabbis. It is, I would say, historically Black, by the way, not all their rabbis necessarily. Certainly in the future, as they're becoming somewhat Hispanic, are all Black. But in any case, there's an Israelite board of rabbis. There is a group in Dimona, Israel, who are the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. They live in Dimona, and their official title is African Hebrew Israelites, not Black Hebrews, okay? There are lots of different groups with all kinds of different names. What they share is skin color and some practice that may be or may be related to Judaism. So I want to go to a bit of a history lesson before I come back to the 60s and tell you about one particular strain of people who are unfortunately today lumped together as Black Hebrew Israelites. Again, I will repeat this as conflation, and I am working at the forward to come up with a style guide so that once and for all, we can call people by what they should be called, what they like to be called themselves, and not to conflate them with other people who have nothing to do with their practice. One more thing, since we're virtually in New York, there are people in Times Square who are very vocal and dress very colorfully. They have a title that, after you forgive me because I'm not making light of it, but it's something like the People's Church or Temple of Eternal Knowledge. They wear Stars of David. They are conflated as Black Hebrew Israelites. Trust me, they have nothing to do with other people who live in, go to shuls that may look like many of yours and do things that look very Jewish. So that's part lesson, part soapbox, which I think is my privilege to do as a very special type of journalist. I did practice journalism. So around the turn of the century, or a little bit before, after emancipation, there were African Americans who were considering their freedom and considering the idea of religion. Certainly religion had been imparted to them, Christianity, and came to the conclusion, this is not an overwhelming number, but, well, we could not possibly be the religion of the slaveholders, okay? And this makes a lot of sense. I'm not suggesting that people retain Christianity didn't make sense, but I'm saying that is a fairly perfectly understandable position to take. And if you go before that, you actually find, I mean, we know this from Negro spirituals, that the Exodus story actually resonated very powerfully to enslaved African Americans, okay? More so, I would maintain, and I'm happy to be shot down on this, but again, if you look at the liturgy, you look at the vocal, the oral tradition, and you listen to the songs that talk about the Jordan River and talk about crossing the freedom, that they're far more, this is resonating far more than Christianity's basic promise of eternal bliss in the afterlife, okay? I mean, there's sort of an immediacy here that the people who are enslaved are looking for freedom now. They're not saying, well, if I die, wonderful things will happen. I'm not saying, again, nobody thought that, but that is a strain that was definitely prevalent during antebellum days and amongst enslaved people. So postbellum, it's quite natural that some groups would arise that would continue along that theme and adopt what we would call Judaism. They didn't necessarily just go to a synagogue. We could all talk about Jews in the South. That's a whole long story. But you know, how many synagogues would have been there and welcoming to them? Who knows? By the way, I'm not suggesting it never happened. There was definitely, even during slavery times, a Black Jewish gentleman in South Carolina who belonged to a mainstream Jewish synagogue. There were Black Jews who were really can be traced to colonial times. There was one in Maryland who I think was a, Sabrina's nodding her head there, so if you want to help me on that one, I think he was some sort of an official. And I'm going to tell you something you probably don't know, Sabrina. Denzel Washington portrayed him in a college production, okay, of something. His name was D'Souza. So, you know, and obviously, I think we all know enough of Jewish history in the United States to know that Sephardic Jews actually predated Ashkenazi Jews here. So Sephardic Jews kind of look like my complexion a lot, you know. Sometimes they look a lot darker than my complexion. They look like anything. So to say Jews of color in the United States, I think you're talking about before there was something called the United States. In any case, African Americans who were not Jewish adopted some Judaic practices. And these formed as synagogues. They are, you know, I can't imagine anybody here doesn't know, but they certainly had a presence in New York City. They had a presence in, you know, kind of remote areas too. I want to say Langston, Kansas, because a lot of things happened there, but Philadelphia, certainly Chicago, all across the country. And one thing they called themselves, well, I'll tell you what they didn't call themselves. They didn't call themselves Black Hebrew Israelites, okay? They certainly did not call themselves Black. Now, when I say they, by the way, I'm not speaking for every possible group out there. Who knows that there wasn't a minion of somebody in Langston, Kansas, who said, we are the Black Knights of the Eternal Freedom. I'm sure something like that happened. But for the most part, the larger congregations of what today would become Israelite congregations were usually called Hebrew or Israelite or something like that, and actually not Jewish. You may say, well, this is kind of separating themselves right there from mainstream Jews. Not true. If you look at mainstream, and I would say largely white, I'm not going to say white because in all cases, somebody could have wandered in there. And again, our, Sephardic and Mizrahi brothers and sisters of darker hues certainly did wander in there. We know that. So, but in any case, in mainstream Jewish congregations at the time, the word wasn't Jew either. I don't think there's too many places that call themselves so-and-so Jewish congregation. But you do see Hebrew congregation. In fact, if you go back to the 19th century, you see Hebrew an awful lot. Some of my indirect relatives, well, no, they're direct relatives were Felsenthals. And if you meet a Felsenthal or a Birkenstein, those are ancestors or relatives of mine. My ancestors were Felsenthals in Birkensteins, along with Washingtons and Balaams and a bunch of other people. And Rabbi Felsenthal in Chicago was quite prominent. You will see references to him as a Hebrew. You'll see a lot of references at that time to Hebrews rather than Jews. I'm not saying Jew wasn't used. I'm just saying that Hebrew was popular. This was part of, not necessarily completely, but part of this was with the reform movement that was forming. And actually my ancestors had something to do with that too. And in that reform, some people took reform quite seriously to the degree that in Chicago, one temple was having services on Sunday. And to top it off, my dear ancestor, he's indirect, that's why I'm a little hesitant on him, but his Rabbi Felsenthal's father would have been one of my great-greats. He's a great-great uncle or something. But Rabbi Felsenthal is referred to in some documents, and not just him, as Reverend. So understand that what we view as normal trappings of Judaism today was not necessarily the case. And so if you look at these African-American congregations that are emulating Jews, you see that they're emulating Jews. They're calling themselves Hebrews. They may be using Reverend, although most of them are not actually, they're using Rabbi. And they may be doing things that, again, without the benefit of a historical analysis, you could think, well, they're doing something quite different. So they were certainly seen. You can't very well have synagogues in Harlem without anybody noticing it. And there were interactions with the mainstream or the white Jewish community. But they didn't necessarily get together. In fact, they did not at all. There was out and out rejection at some points. Rabbi Matthew of the Commandment Keepers, which is one of the major congregations of Black congregations in New York City, sought membership in the New York Board of Rabbis. I believe it's two times, one in the 1930s and again in the 1950s. I believe it was 31 and 51, but in exact dates. And he was summarily rejected. And you see, waited 20 years and he did it again, and he was rejected again. If you're rejecting people, do the people who are being rejected just say, oh, okay, I'll go away and everything's cool? And if you're talking about a religious organization, does the liturgy, just stay inviolate and we keep doing everything that everybody else is doing, or does it change? I'm asking this, again, we have a rhetorician, I'm asking this rhetorically to obviously say, of course, no, things do not stay the same, they evolve. And just a little bit of the study of religiosity I've done, I'm fascinated by how religions evolve, how canons are developed. If I had one place in history to go, it would be, and I always mispronounce it, the Council of Nicaea, where 300 years after Jesus, a whole bunch of people that were kind of like bishops and all kinds of things got together and decided what Christianity was. I'm sure there was a group that was sat out in the corner advocating for Mary Magdalene, and they lost. So these things evolve, and as situations change, they evolve with it. religion has a wonderful ability to adapt to new things that happen and then change its theology accordingly sometimes, even though we're supposedly dealing with the Word of God. But I'm not going to give opinions on that. I'm just saying what happens. So part of the theology, if you will, or liturgy of Black congregations, who are by this time pretty much summarily rejected by white congregations, is to disparage the white congregations. And part of it, by the way, there's other forces happening at the same time. Marcus Garvey has his program going on, a very Afrocentric program, an early one. And so such a thing as Black Pride, although not called it at the time, is being developed and promulgated. And so Blackness is not necessarily seen as a bad thing as it had been. Certainly, by the way, if you talk about my great-grandparents, they would never use the word Black. I can tell you that right now. And they were very embarrassed about slavery. One of my family histories has all kinds of people in it by one of my great aunts. And she's got great documentation, well, doesn't have much documentation, but great oral documentation or oral tradition of our Cherokee ancestors, of our supposed Blackfoot ancestors, which is not true, because Blackfeet Indians are in the Montana and Blackfoot are in Alberta, and not the southeast United States where our family comes from. But Blackfoot seems to have been a code word because it keeps coming up in African American oral histories. And she also talks about our Irish history. She doesn't talk about our African history, interestingly, because it's from a time that's left over from embarrassment of slavery. So anyway, all these forces that are at work, and there is a strain of Black congregations who say, well, we actually are the real Hebrews or the real Jews, if we're using the word Jew at the time, that they actually came from Africa and were stolen and put on slave ships, and here we are. And in fact, the white people across town are the imposters. So this doesn't go over very well with the white people who, are being called imposters and who may be thinking about some outreach. I mean, stuff is happening. People are wandering into synagogues. They are seeing each other. There are articles in the forward. Certainly in forwards, there would have been articles, pictures. I've searched it. Our wonderful archivist, Hannah Pollock, is, well, we've been doing some searching lately, but I know she's all over this too. So by the time of the late 50s and early 60s, you could pretty much say that relations between white Jewish congregations or mainstream Jewish congregations and Black congregations, certainly in New York City, are strained or non-existent at best. And that they kind of know about each other, but there's very little cross-fertilization going on. By the way, at some point, that comes a little bit later. So that's where we are. But at the same time, like I said, Marcus Garvey is going on in the world, slavery goes on, all of these different influences at different periods of time, right? So what's going on? I'll throw it out for a question. Everybody knows the answer to this. In 1960, what's the big thing happening in this country in the early 60s? Somebody. If nobody gets this, we're going to take another class. We talked about it last week.
Civil rights movement.
Civil rights, of course. And so in the civil rights movement is very famously hailed or cited as really the ultimate cooperation between the Black and Jewish communities, the ultimate alliance of the two. So this is happening right now, in the early 1960s, and no one can ignore it, and nor do they want to ignore it. The Black and Jewish participants in the civil rights movement, and as we pointed out last week, the Black Jewish participants in the civil rights movement are certainly well aware of each other. They are, totally in this thing together. Um, uh, I could let Professor Firmheimer talk a little bit more about other influences that would have happened, but I want to give you the lay of the land at the time. So it makes perfectly good sense that some of our liberal, open thinking Jews and blacks would want to do something together. And Rabbi Irving Block rather, of the Brotherhood Synagogue in Greenwich Village, thinking along these lines. Another gentleman, Yaakov Gladstone, was teaching at a Hebrew day school, I believe. And one of his students was a young African-American student who belonged to Mount Horeb congregation in the Bronx, which is one of our historically black congregations. He was intrigued by this, learned about it, and ends up working with that congregation, the cantor there, to teach the kids their Purim songs. So they get together, Rabbi Block and Yaakov Gladstone, and just in a shorthand version of saying it, Hatzaad Harishon is formed as an outreach effort to bring Black Jews and white Jews together. Notice I didn't say Hebrews, I didn't say Israelites. I'm going to keep repeating this theme because I kind of have to, diffuse or disabuse us of the stuff we've had in our heads lately. So the outreach is made. Now, it's also possible that they could have meant, by the way, halakhic Black Jews, like myself, my mother being Jewish and not Black, and my father being Black and not Jewish. That is, as everybody's heard my stump speech, which to tell you, makes me 100% of each or 200%. And so certainly, by the way, I would have been eligible to join Hatzaad Harishon. I'm in Chicago at that time, doing those marches and sit-ins, as Rabbi Joey told you. One of them significantly was 1963. I remember it like yesterday. And had we had such a program in Chicago, sure, I probably would have been a part of it. I would have liked some outreach to take me to camp. I did not go to a Jewish camp. I didn't go to any camp. And that's one thing that I know my mother thought about, but we just simply never did. But if somebody had knocked on the door saying, does Robin want to go to camp? Yeah, I'd be out there right away. Except I didn't like swing. So the program starts and the outreach happens. And yes, it's possible there were some Black Jews that would not have been questioned what their lineage was. But the most important thing was for those who had lineages that, again, if I'm missing the major point here, that the African-American congregations trace themselves back to the turn of the century and before and post-slavery, never converted to halakhic Judaism, okay, according to mainstream Judaism. That doesn't mean, by the way, they didn't convert. If they were Christians or something of some other religion and they joined this congregation, I'm sure there was some kind of conversion process they had to go through. And that's kind of important because if you said to them, well, you're still not Jews, you got to convert again, I don't know how many people will want to do that. Some did, but I don't know, not necessarily a large enough group. So what's important is as this outreach is being made, no one checked your credentials at the door, okay? And that so much of the outreach is happening to these historically Black congregations. So what did they do? They went to summer camps, which I didn't do. Integrated summer camps, maybe they were the integration to it. They had trips to Israel. This is quite significant because it's before birthday. And I'm even going to suggest, maybe it had a bit of influence on that later being created. The leaders of this organization were very Zionist, and hence the trips to Israel. One thing I would point out, by the way, on the trip to Israel, if you listen as the dates that I mentioned, you notice they're on either side of the 6-day war. So I just think that's an interesting time because going to Israel before and going afterwards may have been two different things. But they had study sessions with students from the Jewish Theological Society. And they were kind of a big deal in New York City. There was a fundraiser that was emceed by Theodore Bickle. The National Advisory Board, I just found this out last night or night before, included Kitty Kaplan. He was the national president of the NAACP. I never met him, but I certainly knew of him in Boston, which is where he was from. This was not a small deal. You know, Kitty Kaplan was a big deal. And most famously, they had a dance troupe, which performed at Carnegie Hall multiple times, more than once, at Town Hall. I mentioned Boston. They actually were on tour in the neighboring states and even on an NBC TV show. So I asked the question earlier, what sort of activity do you think happened at the 92Y on Sunday nights? Should I play Jeopardy music?
Israeli dancing.
Well, almost, actually, yes. And the point is, your building where you are is where they actually came to rehearse and to plan. That was their meeting spot on Sunday nights. And so I just find that totally ironic, because here we are full circle. And we're talking, by the way, it's the organization's demise was 50 years ago this year. So nothing could be more appropriate. So yeah, 1969 was a big year for them. I think it was a year of the NBC show. We could double check that. We have it right in the article. It was also one of their big trips to Egypt. But after that, things started to unravel. First of all, 1969 is a year after the assassination of Dr. King. So when I say things unraveled, I don't just mean among Hatzaad Harishon, but the entire country. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the civil rights group that my family was most associated with, and SNCC, again, Chuck Du's organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, become far more militant and start to expel white people from their ranks. And Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee even goes as far as to change its name to Student National Coordinating Committee, changing its focus entirely. A lot of organizations are becoming more Afrocentric or going to Black control, and not just in the area of civil rights. You have all kinds of like model cities programs, urban development programs, and you know, people are coming to the conclusion, well, maybe we should have Black leaders of these things or Black executive directors. So this is, you know, what is, again, looking at the lay of the land, what is happening at this time. And so did Hatzaad Harishon. Yaakov Gladstone resigns. You can get into all sorts of reasons why. You know, this was obviously a bit of a pressure on them. All the Afrocentrism thing going on, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville controversy of the New York City teachers strike, and the teachers are largely Jewish. The Ocean Hill-Brownsville neighborhood was becoming more Black, and the Black parents there were demanding to have Black teachers in the classrooms. Something, by the way, when that controversy ended, and you're getting something that stores in my journalistic mind. I've never had a chance to check this out, but since you guys are in New York and I'm in Minnesota, maybe you can do this. I'm told that the first two principals hired after the controversy ended were Black Jews. So somebody want to check that out? Be fascinating to find out. If you do, we'll put it in the forward. And it shouldn't be that hard to find out. And so Hatzaad Harishon, it gets a Black executive director. But, you know, the thing is just too many pressures are happening. Another one, as I mentioned, the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, or at that time, Black Hebrews is the word's name that I remember them from. They were from Chicago. They went to Liberia, and then they went to Israel. That's happening at the same time. In Israel, they're claiming to be the true Jews, and they're still there today. These controversies are still going on today. On the other hand, they've been, you're talking generations later, people have served in the Israeli army and a part of Israeli society. But Israel recently, in the last year, has talked about deporting some too, back to the United States. Interestingly, deporting some people who never lived in the United States. So, but in any case, that was happening right then and there as in 1970 and 71. On the white Jewish militant side, you had Meir Kahane and the JDL, who at one point pretty much gave the corollary to calling white Jews imposters. He said Black Jews were not legitimate. And there was so much going on that too much was going on. And by 1972, it. So I asked, and this is what we had in the introductory article by Professor Bruce Haynes, to go along with Professor Firmheimer's article. This happened. Could it happen today? Was it a failure? Right? Well, I would say one thing I would disagree with my friend Janice on is in her article, she mentions its short existence. But those of you who were here last week may remember that as I talked about Chuck McDew and quoted from his book about SNCC, and that he was at the founding of SNCC, and then he left and turned it over to John Lewis. And then later on, it was turned over to Stokely Carmichael, and the rest was a short history. In the very beginning of SNCC, Chuck McDew said, this organization should last about 5 or 10 years because things change in society. Now, he didn't necessarily say we're going to accomplish everything and we're going to register every Black person in Mississippi who's been disenfranchised. He wasn't that Pollyannish. But on the other hand, he knew that things would change, and whether they won or not in their quest for equality and equity, that an organization like this only had a certain shelf life. So I would actually apply that to Hatzaad Harishon. I would say that the things that they were trying to do in 1964, I don't think you could do anything, very many things in 1972 the same way you could do it in 64. One other thing, by the way, about the beginning of the organization, Professor Firmheimer mentions that it started just 10 days after the Civil Rights Bill was passed, but it's actually less than a month after the murders of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. I would have to think that was a major impetus in doing this. I could be wrong, but it certainly was, again, a part of the times. So, before one would say failure, you got to look at, first of all, what his expectations would have been. And then secondly, what's the natural life of the program? And then even so, what did it accomplish? We may not know about this organization today, which I find fascinating. I hope we all find it fascinating. We're here. We decided it was worth 2 articles in the forward today. And certainly with the stuff, by the way, that our archivist is digging up, we're going to have more articles. I mean, it's just fascinating stuff. But not only, is the history there and instructive, and I can speak to that in a minute, but don't tell me there weren't relationships that were built. Don't tell me that, do tell me, I will tell you, that some of the members went on to mainstream Judaism. Now, am I saying, by the way, that halakhic or a conversion by, Ashkenazi standards is better than belonging to a historically Black congregation that doesn't have those standards, or, does the same thing, but, doesn't feel the need to be converted twice? No, I mean, you can practice anything you want. That is the beauty of this country. But the fact is, if you wanted to break down barriers between Black Jews and white Jews, and some of those Black participants embraced mainstream Judaism, well, I certainly would say the barriers were broken down. And so, again, without giving any value judgment whatsoever over practicing what and why. So, lastly, I would go to why we're here. And, again, I said it isn't a secret. It wasn't a secret. It happened once, and it could happen again. And when I say this, and I'm being a bit of an advocate more than a journalist, I'm saying that as you pick up a paper, not the forward, thank you, and it talks about some horrible thing happening or some negative thing happening with Black Hebrew Israelites, first of all, deconstruct it, figure out who exactly they're talking about. Who is this group? Okay. And by the way, I'm not saying any particular group is immune from doing horrible or stupid or silly things. That can happen to anybody. Okay. And it does happen amongst anybody. But if you go to the mainstream, historically Black congregations who are, for whatever reason, not recognized as real Jews, okay, well, can you make outreach to them anyway? It happened. That outreach was made. So is there any reason not to do it today? And from that point, on that point, I'll take questions.
Thank you,
Or
Robin,
comments.
for kicking us off. And I would welcome anyone who has a question. I see that Rabbi Rothstein is on, and we're so glad that he's here. And our friends from the Black Jewish Liberation Collective, we thank them for coming too. So if anyone has a question, you can either put it on the chat and Robin will see it, or you can simply just ask. And I would just share, I was getting a kick out of hearing you describe classical Reform Judaism. As a Reform rabbi, I worked at Washington Hebrew Congregation in DC for 13 years. It's a very, very old congregation, almost 300 years old. And in the first prayer books of the Reform movement, it's a minister or, reverend or whatever. There was all English except for the Shema. And that was the only Hebrew pretty much. And when I look at the former rabbis at Washington Hebrew, they were referenced as reverend. And the services were on Sunday mornings to sort of fit in and Americanize, make it a little bit more Protestant-y. What we would call high church music of organs were introduced. A lot of this really to be accepted right into American society. So it's just interesting to hear you sort of add that in. Obviously, the Reform movement has come quite far from those days, but still appreciate the history of it. So I'm just filibustering now. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to ask.
Well, again, though, I would say that's a great filibuster because I can't stress enough. I keep saying it was there's the tenor of the times. There's the lay of the land. And so it tempts me to call you Reverend Joey, by the way. But yeah, I mean, and there's not much more to filibuster about it. But I mean, it just shows how strong that was. And actually, I didn't know about Washington, D.C. I know about Temple Sholom in Chicago. And boy, it was a Sunday. It was a Sunday deal.
Yes. Any of the older Reform synagogues in America, those that are 200, 300 years of age, not like 50 years old in suburbs, generally speaking, will have a classical historical element to it. The most notable, perhaps, in New York City would be Temple Emmanuel. And rather than shifting away from those classical roots, in a sense, they embrace it as part of their identity. And so I they used to be, I think they still are, on the radio on Friday evenings at 5:30. It's a half-hour service. And I say this with affection. You're taken back into time, in a sense, the way the voices of the clergy are articulating the prayers and the formality aspects of it. It's truly fascinating.
Right. Oh, by the way, I forgot to share, if you will, Sue, I have 2 pictures to show.
Oh, right, you had graphics. And Sue, please feel free.
Either one, I can give a comment.
Hi. Hi, I'm Sue. I'm not sure
Oh,
I've
well,
got my
different Sue,
camera
but
on.
go ahead, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Not to
Go ahead.
Sue. Well, my question was, Janice, having done an in-depth study of this, what would you like to add, or what do you think could fill out the story a little more?
It's a pretty big story, and it's one that I was more deeply into about 10 years ago, I want to say. So I don't know if there's a particular aspect that you'd like to ask more about. I can tell you that I got very interested in Hatzaad Harishon based on the archival materials that I found at the Schomburg Center. So those of you who are in New York, and if you're curious, there are 3 beautiful boxes of gorgeous materials from Hatzaad Harishon. They include newsletters, they include youth newsletters, they include correspondence. And in the book, I tried to organize it by looking at specific flashpoints of conflict between Black and white Jews within the organization, and try to talk about how and where their understandings fall apart and where they try to come together. And I was really interested in thinking about how we redefine things that we take for granted, like identity and identity claims. And so I look at Hatzaad Harishon as an organization, as a kind of moment where people were working really hard and in good faith for a good chunk of time, trying to expand the way we think about Jewish identity in pretty specific and particular ways to be more inclusive of Black Jews. Or people who identified as Black Jews. I know Robin and I go back and forth about terminology. And in the book, I take some care and time to really define those terms, because terms are exactly what people were arguing about. So the kind of rise and then the short fall off in 1972 kind of parallels some of the other narratives that we hear about civil rights. But I think that there's a lot more nuance there, and you can see nuance in the resignation letters. So Sybil Kaufman was the white Jewish youth group leader who was leading mostly Black Jews in what she had hoped and imagined would be this wonderful acceptance into the broader mainstream and mostly white community. That's how I term the sort of recognized Jewish community, to distinguish it from some of the African-American communities that were claiming Jewish identity but weren't always recognized by that recognized community, which is not to delegitimize those communities, but differentiate. And there's some really poignant correspondence between her and the youth leader of Rabbi Wentworth Matthews' congregation, where they go back and forth. Some of that didn't make it into the book. It made it into some other publications. But you can see the real humanity of these people trying hard to find common ground. And it kind of lasts ephemerally, and then it kind of slips away. She stepped down in, it was 69, I believe, 68, 69, I'm gonna have to double check again. And then Gladstone steps down in 70. And her letter talks about why she steps down. She really kind of honestly recognized that she couldn't meet the needs of the youth that she was leading. And she espoused some other things that maybe wouldn't go over very well then or now. But the real honesty and vulnerability there, I think, was really interesting to see, and the same for Gladstone. And you see it also when Benjamin, who was the Black Jewish executive director who took over after Gladstone, and he's getting into it with the Black Jewish congregations and also the establishment community. So it's not like one directional, I guess. But that was part of what I was trying to say in the chat is, you get a short piece in the forward, you can't tell the whole book. But part of the larger argument that I make in the book is that actually what they were doing was quite revolutionary. And you can't accomplish revolutionary things all at once. They take time. You kind of poke at a definition and you make a little opening, and people's ideas begin to shift. They may not totally change or completely become accepting, but maybe they shift just a little bit. And maybe the next generation, they shift a little bit more. And then boom, in the 80s and 90s, and now we're in a really different moment, that some of those shifts and changes that we're seeing now might not have been possible if we hadn't seen this organization take those Hatzaad Harishon, those first steps, so we can get to these steps. And I hope I didn't talk too long, Sue.
No, thank you, Janice, for that. You're adding more depth to this, which is great. I've seen a few hands, and the order
it suggests also that Bruce has his hands up, and he's the other author of the other story in the forward today.
He was the second hand. So Bruce,
Okay.
if you want to add on to what Janice said, and then we'll
And
go
I'm
to
sorry,
Brian,
it was
and then
Sharon.
Yes.
It was Sharon is who I'm speaking to. If you could show the two graphics, just one is of the two leaders of Hatzaad Harishon, Yaakov Gladstone, there it is, and Esther Bibbins, who I believe, Janice could correct me if I'm wrong, was the president of the organization. This ran in the forward. It's fascinating, and they're talking about a book drive. It happened at one of the black shuls. And then the
go
second
ahead,
one, very
Ron.
briefly, so that I can shut up and get to. This is again just a historic picture. Everyone should
Wow.
have seen this. In fact, you had a presentation at 92Y not long ago about this. I think last year. And this one is the Moorish Zionist Temple of the Moorish. And here I'm wrong. They use Jews. Okay. But
Fantastic.
yeah. I mean, so be it.
Robin, I just want to be mindful of everyone's
Yeah,
time.
I'm done.
And Brian had a question, and then Bruce, and then Rabbi Cooper, and then Shoshana. So we'll go in that order, and just try to be mindful of the time, everyone.
So I'll make just ask two quick questions, although they're unrelated. The first, could you talk a bit more about the origins of these Black congregations, as to how what kinds of movements, what gave birth to them, where did they originate, how did they come to New York? And then the second was, I know of Kivi Kaplan largely because I had actually worked at the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism as an intern, and I was actually a Machon Kaplan intern, which was named for him. One of the things that I know about him is in regard to his civil rights activities, was he actually helped to fund a number of schools that were a part of the Booker T. Washington movement of, I can't remember the name of the schools that had been created that were a part of sort of the vocational training side of the civil rights movement. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, because there seems to have been some folks in the Jewish community who sort of were more in tune with W.E.B. Du Bois's view of how African Americans were to liberate themselves, and Booker T. Washington's contrasting view.
Well, yeah, and well, they actually, all I would say very briefly to both of those, I'm going to defer to your first question to Bruce, who can tell you more about the origins of the groups, because I'm sorry, I'm pushing books here. This is Bruce's book, The Soul of Judaism, and he talks all about Black Jews or Black Judaic people or Black anything. So he could, because we also want to get to his question. And seriously, I would actually, again, refer you to his book for the answer, because it's way too long to get into here.
Okay.
The second part is, yeah, I mean, there's a tradition of Jewish philanthropy toward Black education, absolutely no question whatsoever, Tuskegee Institute itself. But the whole idea of, yes, there was, of course, a conflict between Booker T and W.E.B., but that doesn't mean they weren't complimentary. So Booker T, W.E.B. Du Bois, well, he may have said, "Don't give money to him, give it to me." But in all seriousness, he was not necessarily against manual training, he was for, Black improvement. And so, it's sort of like the phrase we use more recently is you need your Malcolm and you need your Martin. You need both sides of the argument. So, again, getting into deep historical stuff way beyond my ken, how much did they fight and all? I'm more actually aware or more familiar with William Monroe Trotter, who definitely was on the W.E.B. Du Bois side in Boston and his Guardian newspaper and that. But, he's certainly wouldn't be in the business of telling for philanthropists not to support Black education and so forth.
I'd like to move over to Bruce, since we're talking about his book anyway.
Well, terrific. Thank you for that, Robin. And I guess my first comment, I'll go back to Janice's book. I just want to say I used Janice's book quite extensively because her analysis of the language and rhetoric that was taking place on the ground allowed me to make some connections that I was trying to make in my book. And so I'm kind of standing on her shoulders to some degree. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen as the evolution of this conversation has taken place over the past 20 years. We know a lot more about things today than we did 20 years ago. And we're constantly learning new things and transforming our knowledge. I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Robin had said, sort of chronologically. First, about slavery. I think we really underestimate how deeply the religion of slavery identifies with the Israelites, the Israelite story, the story of the Exodus and redemption. And so that I think is important to emphasize. The second piece I wanted to just to complicate things is, as you mentioned, Garvey's coming in the 20s and 30s. Well, there are other Caribbean Black folks coming as well, and some of them have Jewish ancestry, and some of them identify as Jews. So in Harlem and places in the 30s, all these folks get all mixed up, right? And so when you try to sort them out now, that gets to be quite problematic. So you have a direct Caribbean influence that, just like many Reform Jews today, is patrilineal descent. So the question becomes, is patrilineal descent, is that good enough to make you Jewish? So that to me is sort of the Israelite question. Third thing I just wanted to mention, a gentleman by the name of Sapoznik, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. That's the next person who you need to get to write about, because he has all of this fascinating material about these Yiddish performers and singers in the 1930s and 20s. And so I just wanted to throw that in as another ripple to suggest that Hatzaad Harishon is not really the first. It's like this was an evolution that was been taking place over the 20th century to bring us to the point where we're having this conversation today.
Thank you so much. I love that all of our authors are here together and that you're all sort of helping each other give us a fuller picture. Rabbi Cooper.
Actually, Shoshana was on before me, so.
Oh, okay, please. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi Cooper. Also, hi, Robin and Bruce and so many other people here. It's nice to be in the space with all of you, and I'm grateful to be learning about this very important work. It is so relevant today to the work that myself and some of my comrades here on the call have been engaged in. We've been thinking deeply about all of these questions and what it looks like in practice. So moving from like what the historical perspective of this work is to what does it look like to do this work today. And so I'm curious to hear from, all the folks that have spoken and have this expertise, have done this research. What might you imagine have been some of the implications of this history on today's work? Meaning, I grew up in the Bronx, and I grew up, in Orthodox community, but also sometimes attending an Ethiopian synagogue, and at other times attending mostly Purim with the commandment keepers, actually. And so I have a pretty vast, diverse experience of Judaism here in New York, which is unique. But that said, those communities were always, in my experience, or have in my lifetime, been very separate and distinct, and not overlapping and not engaging with each other. And oftentimes in my organizing and my thinking of this, I've considered the racial implications of why this might be. But I'm curious if you can speak to if that is on target, if my assessment of that is on target with regard to the threats that might be posed to the larger white Jewish community in engaging with other Black Jewish or Black Hebrew Israelite communities. And also if there are other pieces that I'm missing beyond the race piece here, and the holding on to whiteness or proximity to whiteness, rather, right? Like not even that it's fully owned by the Jewish community, but rather that the white Jewish community has this proximity to whiteness that can feel very fragile. I'm just curious to hear what some of the implications for our current organizing can look like as we think about this strategically, because it is a big question in our collective. And it means that if we choose, we've been really thoughtful that if we choose one path to engage in one way, that might mean that there are some people that will choose to distance themselves from us. And vice versa, right? And the reverse as well. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts or advice or strategic ideas.
I have a very quick answer, which is you're doing
I was
the
going
right
to say
thing.
in brief.
Yeah, very brief. You're doing the right thing. The whole point of everything we've been talking about for the last week too, is nobody's binary. We got the whole non-binary thing going on, okay? And that's great. And that's one particular area, the whole gender issue. Fine, okay. But nobody is really binary. I mean, everybody's, look, my Lubavitch rabbi here, my Chabad rabbi in Duluth, Minnesota, turns out his family is Cuban. So he's saying, am I Hispanic? But his family's only Cuban because they came from Europe escaping Nazi Germany and went to Cuba. So they started out as white people. Then in Nazi Germany, they weren't white anymore. Then they went to Cuba and they were, actually they were white there, but now they come to the United States, they're considered Hispanic, right? And you wouldn't know this. This is just a Chabad rabbi sitting around Duluth, Minnesota, right? The point is because there are all these cross-fertilizations, Bruce referred to it with the cantors, those Black cantors are singing at quote unquote white Jewish congregations. So there have been outliers and there always will be in the human race throughout history. And really, and I'm an outlier, that's why I'm here. And that's the point, is we're the people who carry on the message. You know, there's, you know, for me, Black and Jewish has been reality from day one. So it's never been a conflict. That doesn't mean I can't see the conflicts. Doesn't mean I can't see the problems, but I certainly can recognize what I'm seeing.
Thank you. And Shoshana, thank you for not just presenting that, but also as you were speaking, I was looking at different terms being put onto the chat, and I'm looking forward to now exploring some of those, the ones I'm not familiar with. Rabbi Cooper.
It seems to me that a large part of the discussion concerning the Black Hebrew congregations is really looked at from kind of a gatekeeper mentality and questioning the legitimacy of these congregations. My question is, have we reached a point now where we can get out of that mentality of the gatekeeper approach and proceed of these congregations as an enhancement to our larger Jewish community, and not practice this game of minute legitimacy inspection?
And I would just say that's the entire point of this talk, and to show that it has happened before, as Janice said, they took incredible first steps. And so there's no reason it can't happen again. But you have to have the will. You have to want to do it. But I'll tell you right now that because it has happened, you can't say it could never happen. It never would work.
Yeah. I really want to say thank you, not just to Robin, but to JFNA and the Forward, and also to Janice and Bruce and all those who, and Shoshana, those who have really heightened our discussion by adding to it. We really appreciate it. Next week on the 15th, we're very lucky to have Alana Kaufman, who is the Executive Director, CEO of Jews of Color Initiative. She'll be presenting as we move now from Black Jewish history to Black Jewish futures, sort of the landscape of where we are today from their Beyond the Count huge informative data research that they've done. And then 2 days later, we have Cantor David Fair doing, yes, music, but also narrative. And it should be beautiful. And then just looking ahead, our rabbinic intern, Evan Trailer, and a song leader, Sumner Lewis, they're joining together, and we're offering a second night Seder, but it's a Freedom Seder at 92Y. So stay tuned for more information. And we thank Robin so very much. It's amazing what Google can do. I never would have found you otherwise. So thanks for sharing your wisdom and your humor and your menschlichkeit with us. And Janice, B'sha'a Tova, I just noticed you're having a baby this week. You very casually put that in the chat. B'chatzacha. And Robin, I'm sure we'll see you again soon. Thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.